Welcome to the Intrigue Podcast, where we explore various ideas from across the world, from across time, from a curious, intrigued, and excited standpoint. My name is Ler Jawar. Our exploration of the brilliant work of Sigmund Freud has led us from his work on dreams to his work on sexuality. And now finally we find ourselves exploring his work beyond the pleasure principle. Now, Beyond the Pleasure Principle is a book where Freud asserts some of his theories regarding drives to life, drives to death. But without further ado, let us begin. A great deal of psychic processes seem to be governed by the pleasure principle. The pleasure principle states that all the mental actions of the human psyche are directed either towards the acquisition of pleasure or the avoidance of displeasure. The pleasure principle, says Freud, is regulated by the reality principle, which would affirm that pleasure can be acquired, but at the expense of delayed gratification. No pleasure now for pleasure later. However, an interesting flaw is noticed in the pleasure principle, especially if one is to decide that the pleasure principle governs all mental processes. I quote to you Beyond the Pleasure Principle. It must be pointed out, however, that strictly speaking, it is incorrect to talk of the dominance of the pleasure principle over the course of mental processes. If such a dominance existed, the immense majority of our mental processes would have to be accompanied by pleasure or lead to pleasure, whereas universal experience completely contradicts any such conclusion. The most that can be said, therefore, is that there exists a strong tendency towards the pleasure principle or circumstances, so that the final outcome cannot always be in harmony with the tendency towards pleasure. End quote. Freud, being a psychoanalyst, uses victims of trauma to expose an interesting contradiction in the pleasure principle. Victims of trauma are seen to have a tendency of compulsively repeating painful experiences through, most of the time, dreams. In particular instances, we see neurotics having seizures where they're wrought by extremely painful memories. Now, one may argue that this only shows a particular masochistic tendency in the ego, and Freud himself explored this line of thought. Perhaps the ego to some extent just enjoys inflicting pain upon itself, so it's pain with the outcome of pleasure. However, universal experience completely contradicts this. Victims of trauma and even neurotics don't seem to derive pleasure from the extremely self-destructive tendencies they possess. While with victims of trauma, it may be restricted to the mind, while the painful experiences may just come from dreams or from sudden onslaughts of particular memories. We can see that neurotics sometimes take to inflicting physical pain upon themselves. Some neurotics cut open their wrists. Others could shove pins in their ears. Others even chew glass. This asserts that not the entire human psyche cannot possibly be governed by the pleasure principle. There is a strong tendency in humans' mental space to derive pleasure. There's a strong tendency towards the pleasure principle. However, this is not the all governing force. This compulsion to repeat painful experiences is an important characteristic in the hypothesis Freud introduces to explain the tendency to reenact painful experiences. This hypothesis is called the death drive. The psyche, according to Freud, is always caught between two opposing forces. And Freud, being a person who loved classic literature, names a good deal of his theories after ancient Greeks. The first force is eros. Eros is the drive to life, the drive to pleasure, the drive to creation, connection, and growth. The second drive is thanatos, the drive to death, the drive to the return of an absolute zero point of tension, the drive that seeks stasis, repetition, destruction, and an ultimate return to non-existence, to inanimity. One might say that the death drive inadvertently leads to pleasure. I mean, aren't we just avoiding feelings of displeasure if we want ourselves to cease feeling completely? I don't think so, or at least Freud seems not to think so. He says that living things come from inanimate matter, and ergo strive to return to that state. He believes life is a detour from stasis, and that in all living organisms, apparently not just humans, there's an unconscious pull towards entropy. It's not just the escape from feelings of displeasure. It's an absolute drive to return to no tension at all. This drive has nothing to do with pleasure or displeasure. The death drive operates inwardly at first. And which means against the self, which would explain masochism and other self-destructive tendencies, self-sabotage, the self-infliction of pain. Later, however, it is directed outwards, becoming aggression towards others. So Freud's theory has not only helped explain self-sabotage and self-aggression, but he's also explained pollution and war. So apparently, the death drive doesn't just work to return the self to stasis, but it strives to return every living thing it can have access to towards a state of entropy. Freud's theory on the death drive is one of his most unsettling and philosophically radical ideas. The notion that every living thing harbors a desire to return to lifelessness, not as a reaction to suffering, but as a fundamental part of its nature. It challenges the way we think about existence itself. It's a tumultuous road of thought to go down. Death exists as a thread woven into life from the very start. This is even a statement not just in the psychological and the philosophical, but in the cosmic as well. A statement about the fundamental forces of the universe. But remember, while thanatos exists, while thanatos pulls all that is alive towards lifelessness, towards stasis, towards repetition, towards inanimity, eros exists as well, drawing people to creation, to pleasure, to growth. That brings our exploration of beyond the pleasure principle to an end. If you did indeed enjoy this episode, please like, subscribe, and share. Thank you.